The room itself is small and square, built of plaster and old timber, with a packed earth floor swept clean the evening before. Along one wall, a long wooden bench sits beneath the window, and beside it, a stool with a worn cushion waits for the weaver to take a place. But the whole center of the space belongs to the loom, a low warp loom stretched horizontal and steady, its 4 heavy corner posts dark with age and beeswax. The warp threads run from the cloth beam at the far end to the warp beam at the near end, passing through the shafts and the reed in a long, shallow plane no higher than the weaver's waist when seated. Hundreds of cream-colored linen threads lie parallel, each one pulled to an even tension months ago, checked and rechecked during the warping, and now as stable as the strings of a quiet instrument. For a long moment the weaver simply stands at the edge of the loom, letting the eyes travel along those straight lines without a need to touch anything. The low warp loom is patient. It holds the work exactly as it was left the evening before, the fell of the cloth lying halfway down the length of the frame, the rest of the warp still open and untouched. Beneath the stretched threads, supported on a low shelf built into the loom's frame, rests the cartoon, a full-scale drawing in charcoal and pale washes on pieced parchment that shows the whole design for the tapestry. Through the cream warp, the dark lines of the cartoon rise up in a soft, ghost-like map, and the weaver kneels briefly to peer at the section that will be worked today, a bit of forest floor where the first leaves begin to scatter toward the lower border. The kneeling motion is slow, almost ceremonial, and the weaver's hand rests on the smooth beam without disturbing a single thread. The air in the workshop carries a smell that anyone else might call simple, but that the weaver knows in layers: the dry, grassy scent of the linen warp, the mellow oiliness of raw woolly still waiting in baskets, and the faint mineral dust that rises from the rushes scattered by the door. Beneath that, there is a trace of something sharper, the iron-rich tang of a mordant used to fix madder dye in a basket of red wool, now sealed away under a damp cloth to keep it from fading. All these smells mingle without hurry, just as the light slowly climbs down the plaster wall, brightening from grey to a soft yellow-white. The weaver crosses to the bench and sits, letting the cushion settle with a sigh that is not weariness, but simple adjustment. The seat faces the length of the loom, and from this angle the cartoon shapes are clearer. Here the arched back of a running hound, there the curved neck of a turning deer, and farther up, the delicate charcoal circle of a falcon's hooded head. None of these figures are woven yet. They are only promises held in the lines beneath the warp. The weaver regards them without expression, memorizing the way a vine curves around a tree trunk, because once the weft threads begin to cover the warp, the cartoon will become harder to read. Before the first shuttle is lifted, there is a small ritual of readiness. The weaver pushes back the loose sleeves of a linen undertunic and checks the arrangement of tools on the small tray that rests across the loom's side beam. A wooden comb with polished teeth lies beside a pair of iron scissors no longer than a finger, and next to them, 3 bobbins wound with different colors wait in a neat row. The bobbins are small turned wood pieces, each one fitting comfortably into the cup of a hand, and the weaver picks up the first without hurry, weighing it once in the palm as if to remind the fingers of its balance. The wool on this bobbin is a deep moss green dyed last summer with weld over a woad bath, and it smells faintly of the river water in which it was rinsed. A second bobbin holds a brown the color of walnut shells, and the third is wrapped with a small amount of golden silk reserved for the tiniest details of the border. Before any weft can enter the warp, the weaver must open a shed. With the left hand, the weaver reaches for one of the cord loops that hang down from the heddle bar overhead, a simple wooden bar from which the string heddles descend to lift alternate warp threads. A gentle tug, and a narrow gap opens across the width of the warp, a space no thicker than a finger, but perfectly clear. The right hand takes the bobbin with the moss green wool and passes it through this opening from left to right, laying the weft thread in a single straight line. The bobbin leaves the hand just long enough to travel the whole width, and then the fingers catch it on the far side, drawing the thread through until a small tail of wool remains. The weaver does not pull tight. The thread is left slightly slack, a soft arc hovering over the warp, because tension comes later. Now the comb is lifted. The weaver uses it first to press the new weft thread gently against the fell of the cloth, not with force but with a series of small, patient taps that travel from one side to the other, ensuring the thread lies parallel to the previous one. The comb's teeth pass between the warp threads without catching, and the sound it makes is a soft wooden clicking, a sound so repetitive and low that it becomes part of the room's silence rather than breaking it. After the first thread is settled, the weaver releases the heddle, the shed closes, and the warp returns to its flat, resting state. The weaver then changes the shed with a different cord, lifting the opposite set of warps, and passes the bobbin back from right to left. Another moss-green line settles beside the first, and the comb taps it into place. 2 picks of weft are now woven, and the surface of the tapestry, still mostly bare warp beyond the previously finished area, has grown by the width of 2 threads. The process is so gradual that watching it would feel like watching a slow morning cloud cross a window. Outside, the city is beginning to stir. A cart passes in the street, its wooden wheels rumbling low and distant, and a single bell rings from the direction of a parish church, calling the early risers to prayer. The weaver does not look up, but the sounds drift through the high window and settle into the workshop, like the light itself, adding to the quiet rather than disturbing it. No one knocks on the door, and no urgent voice calls from the alley. The year 1430 in this part of Burgundy is a year without war at the doorstep, a year of breathing, and the die registers in the town ledger show steady purchases and no interruption. The weaver works the moss green across the width for some time, building the foundation of a shaded forest floor. The color is not uniform across the bobbin. Small variations in the dye lot cause the wool to shift from a deep olive to a lighter sage in places, and the weaver uses these shifts deliberately, turning the bobbin over the warp so that the lighter patches fall beside darker ones in a subtle dappled effect. To an observer, the change might be nearly invisible, but the weaver sees it as clearly as a scribe sees the difference between one ink and another. The fingers move without haste, and the eyes rest on the warp in a soft focus, watching the way the light catches the tiny fibers of the wool as each thread is laid down. Time passes without being counted. The patch of sunlight on the plaster wall moves from above the window down to the level of the loom's side beam, its shape shifting from a long rectangle to a softer lozenge. The weaver pauses only to stretch the hands briefly, flexing the fingers and rolling the wrists once, before picking up the second bobbin, the walnut brown. The shed is changed, and the first brown thread crosses the warp, establishing the edge of what will become the trunk of a great oak tree. The brown wool is slightly coarser than the green, spun from the fleece of a local long wool sheep, and it catches on a warp thread once, causing the weaver to stop and smooth it free with a fingertip. This tiny interruption is met with the same calm as everything else. The thread is freed, the bobbin continues, and the comb taps the brown beside the green as if nothing at all had happened. By the time the oak trunk has risen 2 finger widths over the course of many weft passes, the morning has advanced enough that the weaver rises from the bench to bring a cup of water from a small earthenware jug on the windowsill. Drinking is a brief pause, the cool water a quiet note in the throat, and then the place on the bench is resumed, the cushion settling a little deeper this time. The weaver checks the cartoon again, leaning forward to squint at a spot where a root curls away from the oak's base, and traces the line with a clean finger held just above the warp, mapping later work. The gesture is thoughtful, but not slow with indecision. It is the habit of a craftsperson who measures twice before a single thread is added. The morning weaves on. More green, more brown, more small taps of the comb. The weaver works without stopping until the lower border is outlined in a faint band of darker wool, marking the place where the millefleur's pattern will eventually fill the edge with 1,000 tiny flowers. For now, only a single row of dark stitches suggests that border, a quiet promise that the weaver will keep when the time comes. The golden silk bobbin is not touched yet, but it waits faithfully in its row, the sunlight now touching its smooth wooden end with a dot of warmth. At mid-morning, a pigeon lands on the windowsill, coos once, and departs. The weaver's head lifts for only a moment at the sound, and then the work continues. By the time the bells ring for tierce, the woven surface has grown by less than the width of a hand, yet each thread is exactly where it should be. The weaver sets the bobbin down on the tray and stands, not because the chapter of the day is finished, but because the body asks for a change of posture. The hands rest at the sides, and the eyes travel over the tapestry from one end to the other, seeing both the whole sweep of the design and every individual thread. The morning light is now full and clear, laying a bright wash over the warp that makes the cream-colored linen appear nearly white. In this stronger illumination, the cartoon beneath the threads is barely visible, its charcoal lines faded to the faintest grey shadows. The weaver knows what comes next without needing to see it. Above the forest floor, the hound's paw will rise, and after many days, the deer's flank, and later the hunter's arm. All of it lies waiting in the cartoon, in the weaver's memory, and in the patient structure of the warp that will hold every colour until the last thread is tucked. Sitting again, the weaver picks up the green bobbin and reopens the shed. The shuttle passes, the comb taps, and the rhythm that began at dawn continues unchanged into the fullness of the morning. Nothing hurried, nothing loud, nothing to mark one moment over another. Just the quiet, steady building of a textile that will hang in a castle's great hall for years beyond counting, holding in its wool the memory of this silent room and the weaver's calm hands. And so the morning passes into the early afternoon, a seamless unfolding of thread and time, until the lunch hour brings a pause that the weaver will greet with the same gentle patience that greets every thread. Beneath the low warp loom, resting on a shelf of planed oak that slides out like a drawer, lies the cartoon. It is a full-scale drawing, made not on a single sheet, but on many pieces of parchment, stitched together with linen thread, so that when it is unrolled completely, it stretches nearly as long as the loom itself. The parchment has been scraped thin and smooth, treated with pumice until it accepts charcoal without catching, and the joinings are so neat that the seams show only as faint ridges. The weaver pulls the shelf out a hand's width and lets the morning light fall across the drawing without bending or lifting anything, content to see just a portion of the design at a time. The cartoon is a forest hunt scene, commissioned by a Burgundian duke for the great hall of his castle in the northern lands of his domain. The duke is a man who values beauty and order, a patron of weavers, illuminators, and goldsmiths, and his chamberlain has written letters describing the desired theme, a noble hunt, lush with detail, to warm the high stone walls of a hall that receives the cold wind from the Low Countries. The tapestry is to be large, 20 feet wide and 12 feet high, and it will take the better part of 2 years if the weaver works steadily, though no fixed deadline was ever spoken aloud. In the quiet year of 1430, the weaver knows the duke's messengers are occupied with other matters, and no one will ride through the gates demanding to see the finished cloth before its natural season. The scene in the cartoon unfolds from left to right, a progression of figures woven into a woodland so dense with leaves that the sky appears only in small diamond-shaped gaps between branches. At the left edge, a nobleman rides a grey horse with a high arched neck and a flowing mane. He holds a falcon on his gloved left wrist, the bird's head turned outward as if it has just spotted something moving through the underbrush. The nobleman's clothing is drawn with great care, a halplandy with scalloped sleeves, a belt of linked gold squares, and a small cap with a single feather whose curve is traced in charcoal no thicker than a hair. His face is in profile, calm and young, and the weaver has looked at that face many times without ever knowing whether it represents the duke himself or an ideal. To the right of the horseman, 2 hounds course through a thicket of ferns and low brambles, their bodies stretched low with the energy of the chase. The cartoonist has given them long muzzles and folded ears, the kind of hounds bred in the duke's own kennels, and their paws are drawn lifting from the ground in a sequence that suggests forward motion without ever disturbing the stillness of the drawing. One hound's tail points straight backward like a banner, while the others curl slightly upward at the tip, and the weaver finds these small variations and holds them in memory. Beyond the hounds, partly hidden by the trunk of an ancient oak, a deer turns to look back at its pursuers. The turn of its neck makes a graceful curve that the cartoonist sketched over and over on a scrap piece before committing it to the main parchment, and the weaver can see a faint ghost of an earlier line just beside the final one, a mark not erased but left as evidence of the search for a perfect curve. The deer's eye is a single careful dot of charcoal, and its antlers spread upward into the foliage, where they become almost indistinguishable from the branches of the oak, a visual trick that will require the weaver to use the finest silk threads to keep the antlers from disappearing into the leaves. Above the animals, The woodland canopy rolls in waves of oak, beech, and occasional birch, with ivy winding around the larger trunks and small bunches of acorns drawn here and there in clusters of 3. The cartoonist has used a wash of thin grey ink in some places to indicate areas of shadow, and these washes have bled ever so slightly into the parchment, creating a softness that the weaver will need to interpret with darker wools. Through the highest gap in the leaves, a tiny castle tower rises on a distant hill, its crenellations drawn as a row of small squares that seem, from the weaver's low stool, no larger than a fingernail. This tower belongs to the very castle where the tapestry will hang, a subtle emblem of the domain that the nobleman rides out from and will return to when the hunt is done. Around the entire composition runs a border filled with the millefleur's pattern, 1,000 tiny flowers drawn with the aid of a stencil pricked out of parchment, so that the same daisy, the same viola, the same small rose repeat in a steady rhythm all the way around. The border alone is the work of a patient draftsman, each flower a dozen tiny strokes until the whole rectangle of the cartoon feels like a garden laid flat and pressed between the pages of a prayer book. The weaver crouches beside the loom, careful not to let the shoulder brush the warp threads, and slides the shelf out just a little more to reveal the section where the hounds meet the ferns. Here, at the point where the woven cloth now ends, the cartoon shows a small clearing in the undergrowth with a scatter of fallen leaves and a cluster of stones around a narrow stream. The weaver studies the way the stream curves, the cartoonist's lines flowing in long, uninterrupted strokes that suggest water moving slowly around the stones. 2 of the stones are drawn with cross-hatching to indicate shadow, and the weaver notes this with a silent nod, knowing that when the time comes to weave those stones, the brown wool will need a few rows of darker stitching to capture that small depth. A finger lifts and hovers above the charcoal line of the stream, never quite touching the parchment, because the oils of the skin can smudge the drawing, and the weaver has learned over many years to read a cartoon without disturbing its marks. The finger traces the air just above the vine that curls around the oak's trunk, following it upward until it meets the first branch. And all the while the weaver's eyes take in the exact placement of each tendril and the number of leaves along its length. This quiet study is part of the weaving, as necessary as the shuttle and the comb, because a tapestry is built from the bottom up, and once a section is woven, the cartoon beneath it will disappear from view. The weaver must hold the image in memory, or pause often to peer beneath the fell, or both. The commission for this tapestry was agreed upon 2 winters ago, when a mounted messenger brought a small roll of instructions sealed with the Duke's signet. The instructions, written in a clerk's tidy script on a single sheet of vellum, described the general composition in language that was polite, but not warm. A hunt, a nobleman with a falcon, hounds in pursuit, a deer at bay, the family coat of arms repeated 4 times in the corners. The choice of weaver fell to the master of the workshop, who accepted the work with a bow of the head, and set the apprentice to grinding charcoal for the cartoon. No great ceremony attended the beginning, and no feast was held to mark the undertaking. The commission simply joined the other work in the shop, like a new warp, added to the loom, one thread among many. The cartoon itself was drawn by a man whose name has already faded from the weaver's memory. A journeyman from Bruges who spent 6 weeks in the workshop, bent over the parchment while the weaver warped the loom. He worked in silence most days, only murmuring to himself when a line went wrong, and he left without ceremony once the last flower in the border was stenciled. The weaver has not seen him since, and the cartoon remains as his quiet legacy, a silent collaborator whose hand still guides every pass of the shuttle. Now, in the stillness of the morning, the weaver remains crouched beside the loom with one hand resting on the frame, reading the cartoon as if it were a page of music written in charcoal. The vine that curls around the oak is drawn in a loose spiral with 5 leaves, each leaf shaped like a small spearhead with a central vein, and the weaver counts them under the breath, a habit born of long practice so that no leaf will be forgotten when the weft reaches that height. Beside the vine, a small bird is drawn perched on a lower branch, its body a simple oval with a pointed beak and a line of spots along its wing, a woodpecker perhaps, or a nuthatch, and the weaver decides that it will be woven in a soft grey-blue silk left over from a previous commission, just enough to fill the shape. The quiet year of 1430 is felt in the empty streets and the unhurried tempo of the town. The wars that had troubled the neighbouring lands have paused, the truce holding through winter and into spring, and the Duke's attention has turned to the administration of his estate rather than the gathering of soldiers. In such a year, a tapestry commission is not a matter of urgency. It is a living document of a house's identity, a slow assertion of permanence that will outlast any single season of conflict. The weaver understands this without ever putting it into words, feeling it in the steady budget of time that the workshop can afford to spend on the cartoon alone. The weaver now lifts the cartoon carefully at its edge, peeling it back a few inches from the shelf so that the next section of the hunt emerges from under the warp. This area shows the nobleman's horse in greater detail, the curve of its neck, the patterned trapper that drapes over its flanks, the stirrup with its leather strap, and the Duke's heraldic device embroidered on the trapper in charcoal lines that wait to become threads of gold. The device is a lion rampant with a small shield upon its chest, and the weaver spends a long while examining the angle of the lion's tail and the number of its claws, because a heraldic animal must be woven with absolute accuracy, or the Duke's chamberlain may send a polite but pointed letter of correction. The workshop is silent except for the soft rustle of the weaver's tunic when shifting weight from one knee to the other. A fly buzzes once against the window pane and then falls still. Outside, the town goes about its morning without any sound that reaches this room. The weaver's mind settles into the cartoon like a stone sinking gently into clear water, touching each detail without haste. The nobleman's falcon, drawn with its wings folded and its jesses hanging in two curved lines, will require a tiny amount of pearl grey silk that the weaver knows is stored in a sealed wooden box under the bench. The falcon's eye is a single dot, but it will need a speck of black wool so fine that the weaver will have to split a thread before loading the bobbin. These small necessities are noted and filed away in a patient part of the mind that never forgets. After a long study of the falcon, the weaver allows the cartoon to settle back into place, smoothing the parchment with a palm that moves slowly from the center toward the edges, pressing out any small ripple of air. The warp threads above it settle too, their tension unchanged, and the cartoon lies flat and waiting once more, its charcoal lines rising through the cream linen like the memory of a forest seen through morning mist. The weaver then sits on the bench and simply remains still, looking at the loom as a whole. The woven section glows softly in the daylight, the moss green and walnut brown already beginning to form the forest floor where the hounds will eventually run. Above that, the bare warp stretches taut and pale, marking the space where the work of many months will unfold. Between the woven and the unwoven lies the fell, a distinct horizontal line that advances upward with each session, no faster than the growth of a tree's ring. The cartoon beneath it all is the promise that keeps the weaver's hands moving without hurry, a guide that asks for no speed, only attention. The weaver once had a teacher, an old man who wove in a workshop near Dijon, who said that a good cartoon is like a patient friend who knows the way through a wood and never raises his voice. The teacher's name has softened with time into a warm silence, but his words remain, and the weaver thinks of them now while looking at the charcoal lines. The cartoon does not command, it suggests. It shows the nobleman on his horse, but it does not insist on the exact shade of his houplandi. It shows the deer turning, but it leaves the weaver to decide how the light falls on the deer's flank. In this way, the cartoon is both a map and a conversation, a drawing that will become something slightly different because the weaver's hand will interpret every line through the filter of wool and silk and the tiny decisions of the comb. The morning advances and the light in the room shifts from the cool tone of early day to a warmer honeyed color that pools on the back of the weaver's neck. The weaver does not notice this warmth, except as a distant comfort. Instead, the eyes trace the vine one more time, memorizing not only the shape of its spiral, but the way the charcoal line thickens slightly at the base of each leaf, a mark made by the cartoonist's sharpened stick pressed a little harder at the end of each stroke. That thickening will translate into a slightly darker weft, a shadow that gives the leaf a sense of curling away from the branch, and the weaver stores this knowledge without speaking. No thread crosses the warp yet. This chapter of the day belongs entirely to the cartoon. The weaver will look and look again, and only when the image is as clear in the mind as it is on the parchment with a hand reach for the bobbin. This is the weaver's way, learned across decades, and it fits the quiet year perfectly. In a time of hurry, a weaver might work from a quick sketch and trust to habit, but 1430 asks for no haste, and the weaver gives the cartoon all the time it silently requests. Finally, the weaver stands, brushes a bit of dust from the knee of the hose, and walks to the small table by the window where a jug of water and a crust of bread wrapped in a cloth wait for the midday meal. The cartoon remains under the loom, its charcoal lines undisturbed, its hunt frozen in mid-stride, and the weaver looks back at the loom from the window, seeing the whole shape of the work, the dark bulk of the wooden frame, the pale stretch of the warp, the hidden treasure of the drawing beneath. The quiet year holds its breath, and the afternoon will bring the first careful work on the vine, but for now, the cartoon rests, and the weaver rests with it, a shared pause before the thread begins again. The workshop wall opposite the loom is lined with a series of wide wooden shelves, each one holding baskets and bundles of thread in such abundance that the whole wall seems to breathe a soft, muted palette into the room. The baskets are woven of willow and split reed, some with lids and some open, and they bear the faint oily scent of the raw fleece that still clings to the coarser yarns. Above the baskets, pegged directly into the plaster, hang skeins of silk wrapped in undyed linen cloths to keep the dust away, while on the lowest shelf, a row of clay pots with tight-fitting lids holds the madder and woad powders that wait to become tomorrow's dye baths. The weaver crosses to this wall, not with any urgency, but with the slow, habitual step of someone who knows exactly where every color lives. Morning light slants across the shelves from the high window, picking out the differences between one basket and the next. A large round basket on the left holds a deep heap of moss-green wool, the very color that has been moving across the warp since the first day of the forest floor. The weaver lifts a skein from the top, feeling the slight springiness of the twisted strands, and holds it up so the light can travel through the fibers. The green is not uniform. It shifts in tiny waves from a dark, damp olive at the thickest part of the twist to a paler celery where the dye took less deeply. And these variations are exactly what the weaver needs for the dappled ground beneath the oak. A second skein waits beneath the first and the third, and the weaver counts them silently, estimating how many passes of the shuttle this particular green will yield before the bobbin must be wound again. Beside the green basket sits a smaller, squarer container made of dark oak, its corners joined with dovetails and its lid resting half open. Inside nestle the walnut-brown skeins, spun from a different fleece and dyed in a bath that smelled of crushed hulls and iron mordant during the long afternoon last autumn when they were prepared. The weaver slides the lid fully off and draws out a single skein, letting it hang from 2 fingers while the thumb tests the twist. This brown is meant for tree trunks, for the cross-hatched stones by the stream, and later for the dark outlines of the hound's ear, and the weaver knows it must be strong without being stiff, pliant enough to pack tightly against the green, without pulling the warp out of alignment. The skein passes the test and is laid across the weaver's forearm, where it rests like a sleeping animal. The silk is a different matter. The weaver turns to the pegged skeins on the wall and stretches a hand toward the highest peg, where a length of undyed linen cloth wraps a bundle no larger than a fist. Unwrapping it reveals a small skein of silk that glows faintly even in the indirect light, a color that sits somewhere between old gold, hummy, and the patina on a brass candlestick. This particular silk came to the workshop from a merchant who traveled up from the Italian city-states 2 summers ago, and the weaver has been saving it for the Duke's heraldic details, the lion's mane, the shield, the tiny crowns that will repeat in the border. The skein is so fine that the weaver has to separate a single strand from the rest with a touch as careful as lifting a moth's wing, and the silk makes a faint, silky whisper when it pulls free. With the 3 colors chosen, the weaver carries them to the work table that stands under the window, where a row of empty bobbins waits in a shallow tray lined with felted wool. The bobbins are turned from fruitwood, pear perhaps, and their surfaces have been burnished by countless hours of handling until they gleam like dark amber. The weaver sets the green skein on the table first and selects a bobbin whose weight feels right in the palm, a little heavier than the others, because it will need to carry enough moss green for a full morning's work. The process of winding is a small rhythm that the weaver's hands know so deeply that the conscious mind can drift into stillness while the fingers do their task. The skein is opened carefully, the two ties untwisted, and the weaver drapes the loose ring of wool over the back of a wooden swift that stands at the corner of the table. The swift is a simple cross of smooth sticks that rotate on a vertical spindle, and the weaver gives it a small spin with a fingertip to make sure it turns freely. One end of the green wool is caught through a tiny slot in the bobbin's tip, and then the hand begins to turn the bobbin slowly, drawing the wool from the swift in a steady, even pull. The swift creaks once, a sound so small it would be lost in any other room, but in the quiet of the workshop it is a distinct and peaceful note. The wool passes over the weaver's bent forefinger, and the tension is controlled by the slightest pressure of the thumb, so that the thread winds onto the bobbin neither too loose nor too tight. As the green fills the bobbin from end to end in smooth overlapping layers, the weaver's eyes rest on the warp across the room, where the forest floor waits with its unfinished edge. The rhythm of the winding is slower than the rhythm of the shuttle, and it invites the mind to wander only as far as the next pass of the weft, the next shape that will rise from the warp. The weaver thinks of the oak trunk, how many bobbins of brown it will need before the first branch appears, and whether the silk will hold its gold color when it is packed against the darker wools. These are not worried thoughts. They are the ordinary calculations of a craftsperson, no more urgent than a cook counting onions for a stew. The green bobbin fills to its working level, and the weaver snips the thread with the small iron scissors that live in a pocket of the work table. The bobbin is set aside, its new thread tucked into a notch to keep it from unraveling, and the swift is emptied of the remaining green skein, which is returned to its basket with a pat that settles it among its companions. The brown skein now takes its place on the swift, the deep walnut color catching the light differently, absorbing it rather than reflecting it, and the weaver selects a second bobbin, identical to the first but with a tiny knot in the wood near its base, a mark that helps tell them apart at a glance. The brown wool is coarser than the green, and as it winds onto the bobbin, the weaver's fingers register the texture in a continuous quiet feedback. The twist is slightly tighter, the fibers a little more resistant under the thumb, and the weaver adjusts the winding speed to match. A tiny slub passes under the forefinger, a thickened bit of spin that will need to be woven carefully so it does not create a bump in the tapestry, and the weaver notes it silently, making a mental mark that will be remembered when the shuttle carries this particular bobbin across the warp. The swift spins on, the bobbin turns, and the brown thread piles up in layer after layer until the bobbin is full and heavy. The silk is the last to be wound, and the weaver approaches it with a different pace entirely. The gold silk is so thin that it cannot be wound on the swift in the usual way. It would catch on the slightest roughness and break. Instead, the weaver sits on the stool beside the table and places the small skein over two upright pegs set into a wooden block, a miniature apparatus used only for the finest threads. The silk is pulled by hand in short lengths, wound onto a bobbin that is thinner than the others, more delicate, with a shaft of polished bone instead of wood. The winding is slow, and the weaver holds the breath in a calm pause while turning the bobbin, afraid neither of breaking the thread nor of wasting time, simply moving at the speed the silk requires. The gold catches the sunlight in tiny flashes that shift as the bobbin fills, and by the time the silk is wound, the weaver's hands have settled into a deep tranquility that comes from working with something so fine it demands absolute stillness. All three bobbins now rest in their tray, the green, the brown, and the gold. The weaver rises, stretches the arms once, and carries the tray across the room to the loom, where it is set on the side beam. The empty bobbins from yesterday's work are still there, their threads cut close, and the weaver collects them and returns them to the table, wiping each one with a scrap of wool cloth before placing them back in the empty tray. The room is slightly warmer now as the afternoon approaches, and the light has shifted to a whiter tone that makes the warp look almost silver where it passes over the cartoon. Before settling onto the bench to begin the afternoon's weaving, the weaver pauses at the baskets to collect a few extra skeins, not because they will be needed today, but because it is a habit to have reserves close by. A second skein of moss green joins the first, and a short length of a darker brown, almost black, is added for the deepest shadows. This dark brown comes from a different basket, one that sits apart on a lower shelf, and the weaver handles it with the same gentle regard, knowing it will only be used for the smallest accents, the dot of the deer's eye, the inner curl of the hound's ear. The baskets are rearranged so that nothing is out of place, their lids fitted, their contents protected from the dust that will settle overnight. The weaver now stands behind the loom, looking down at the warp that stretches away toward the cloth beam, and the 3 new bobbins wait in their row, ready. The cartoon beneath shows the next section of the forest floor, with the stream and the stones that will require the brown and the dark brown, and somewhere just above that, the weaver knows. The first hint of the hound's paw will soon appear, but that is for later days. Today's work is simply to continue the shaded ground, one weft after another, building a surface that will hold every figure that comes afterward. The weaver picks up the green bobbin, tests its weight in the hand, and finds it good. The brown bobbin is next, balanced in the left hand and then the right, and finally the gold-silk bobbin is lifted, its bone shaft cool and smooth. The selection is complete, the threads are ready, and the workshop holds its quiet afternoon light like a cup of still water. The weaver lowers the bobbin into place beside the shuttle, and the day's slow rhythm is about to resume, grounded in the colors that have been chosen with such care and such calm that the act of choosing seems less like a decision and more like a conversation with the wool itself. The weaver sits on the low bench and lets the weight of the body settle into the worn cushion, feeling the familiar give of the straw padding beneath the wool cover. The loom stretches forward and away, a long, quiet landscape of stretched threads that waits with the patience of something that has no need to measure time. The 3 freshly wound bobbins rest in their tray on the side beam, moss green, walnut brown, and the delicate bone-handled one with its thread of old gold silk. They sit in a neat row, each one ready to be lifted when its turn in the pattern arrives. The afternoon light has shifted to a soft, steady brightness that fills the room without casting harsh shadows, and the dust motes drift in slow diagonals near the window, visible only when the eye rests on them without focus. The weaver reaches for the green bobbin first, the same one that was carried across the warp through all the morning hours, its thread now reduced by half. The fingers find the end of the wool tucked into the notch at the bobbin's tip and draw it free, letting a short length hang loose. The left hand lifts toward the heddle cords that dangle above the warp like a row of steel bell pulls, each one connected to a shaft that will raise its own set of threads. The weaver's fingers close around the first cord with the ease of long habit, and a gentle downward pull opens the shed across the width of the loom. The warp divides cleanly, the upper threads lifting away from the lower in a narrow, even gap that runs from one side beam to the other, and the weaver sees through that opening the faint charcoal lines of the cartoon still waiting below. The right hand guides the green bobbin into the shed, passing it from the left side of the loom toward the right. The bobbin travels smoothly, the wool unspooling behind it in a single straight thread that catches the light for just a moment as it stretches above the lower warps. When it reaches the far side, the weaver draws it through and leaves a small loop of slack, an extra bit of thread that will tighten only when the comb does its work. The bobbin pauses in the right hand while the left releases the heddle cord, and the shed closes with a soft whisper of linen sliding against linen, the threads returning to their flat resting plane. The first weft of the afternoon lies across the warp, a single line of moss green that is almost indistinguishable from the threads laid down in the morning. The weaver now lifts the wooden comb from its resting place across the fell. The comb is a simple tool, a bar of polished oak with a row of teeth cut into its lower edge, and it fits the hand like a knife handle worn smooth by years of use. The weaver sets the teeth into the warp just ahead of the new thread, tilts the comb slightly forward, and begins to tap the weft down against the fell. The motion starts at the left edge, a series of small, patient strokes that move across the width in a steady progression, each tap pressing the green wool against the previous row. The sound of the comb is a quiet wooden pulse, a series of soft clicks that repeat without hurry, and the weaver's head tilts slightly as the work proceeds, the eyes tracking the newly laid thread to make sure it sits exactly parallel to the one before it. No tap is harder than the others, no area receives more attention, and by the time the comb reaches the right edge, the new thread has become part of the cloth, indistinguishable from the morning's work. The weaver sets the comb down and changes the shed with the second heddle cord, lifting the opposite set of warps. The gap opens again, this time revealing a slightly different arrangement of threads, and the green bobbin passes back from right to left. The weaver's hands move in a slow alternating pattern. Left pulls cord, right passes bobbin, left releases cord, right lifts comb. The sequence has no name, and the weaver never counts the passes allowed. But somewhere in the body there is a quiet tally that knows exactly how many rows have been woven since the morning began. As the afternoon deepens, the moss-green ground grows upward by tiny increments. Each pass of the bobbin adds no more than the thickness of the wool itself to the tapestry, so that a whole hour of steady work might advance the fell by only the width of a thumb. The weaver does not measure this progress in inches. The measure is taken instead in the gradual covering of the cartoon below, in the slow disappearance of a charcoal leaf or a sliver of stream that vanishes beneath the green with each new row. The weaver pauses now and then to lean forward and peer at the cartoon through the unwoven warp, checking the position of a feature that will soon be reached, and then resumes the rhythm without any change in pace. At some point in the mid-afternoon, the green wool on the first bobbin runs out. The thread end slips free of the notch and floats across the warp, and the weaver sets the empty bobbin aside in a small basket kept for that purpose. A second green skein hangs over the swift at the work table, already partly wound onto a spare bobbin, and the weaver crosses the room to finish the winding without any sign of frustration at the interruption. The swift turns, the bobbin fills, and soon the rhythm at the loom begins again as though it had never paused. This interruption is not an annoyance. It is simply a part of weaving, like breathing in and breathing out. The brown bobbin is called into use when the green ground reaches the first of the stream stones that the cartoonist drew with his careful cross-hatching. The weaver studies the charcoal stone through the warp, noting its oval shape and the way the hatching darkens on its lower left side, and then changes the shed and passes the brown wool across the width. The brown is not carried all the way from edge to edge. Instead, the weaver works it only in the section where the stone will be, while the green continues on either side. The two colors meet in a vertical join called a slit, where the threads turn back on themselves and leave a tiny gap, and the weaver's fingers work the join with particular care, making sure the meeting is clean. Later, when the tapestry is taken off the loom, those slits will be sewn closed with fine silk, but for now they are invisible to any eye that does not know to look for them. The first stone takes shape slowly, row by row. Its outline is built in dark brown, almost black, the wool the weaver collected from the lower shelf earlier, and its interior is filled with the walnut brown that varies slightly from one pass to the next as the bobbin turns and reveals lighter and darker patches in the dyed wool. The weaver uses these variations to suggest the rough surface of a river stone, packing the threads a little more tightly at the shadowed edge and leaving the upper side a fraction looser where the light would strike. The cartoon's cross-hatching is honored but not copied blindly. The weaver translates it into the language of wool, and the stone emerges not as a flat shape but as a small volume that seems to sit beneath the surface of the tapestry, its weight suggested by the density of the weave. The afternoon wears on. The bells of the town ring for none, their sound reaching the workshop as a distant, softened peal that rises and falls without demanding a response. The weaver's hands continue their alternating dance, and the body shifts only slightly on the cushion, a small adjustment of the spine or a slight change in the angle of the shoulders. The light from the window moves across the floor in a slow arc, and the shadows of the walk threads lengthen on the plaster wall, creating a second loom in silhouette that weaves its own dark tapestry in parallel. When the second stone is complete and a third has been begun, the weaver pauses to drink from the earthenware cup on the windowsill. The water is cool and tastes of the clay jug, and the weaver stands for a few long moments, looking down at the work from a higher angle. From here, the woven section is a neat rectangle of deep greens and browns, its surface slightly lustrous where the wool catches the light. The unwoven warp beyond it is still a pale cream field, the cartoon below visible as a ghost pattern, and the contrast between the woven and the unwoven is the visual record of the weaver's patient accumulation. The weaver sees this without pride or dissatisfaction. It is simply the work as it stands, a truthful accounting of the hours spent. Back on the bench, the brown bobbin is set aside and the green resumes its dominance, covering the area around the stones with a soft cushion of mossy wool. The rhythm picks up again, as if it had never been interrupted, and the weaver's mind drifts into that state where the hands know what to do without instruction. In this state, the sounds of the workshop become a kind of quiet music, the soft pull of the heddle cord, the hiss of the bobbin sliding through the shed, the tap-tap of the comb, and then the small pause before the next shed opens. There is no variation in the tempo, no sudden changes in the weaver's speed, and the cumulative effect is as regular as a slow heartbeat. The afternoon slides toward evening. The light through the window loses its brightness and begins to warm toward gold, and the weaver's shadow on the wall behind the loom stretches taller and thinner. The green bobbin is nearly empty again, and the brown has been used down to its wooden core, its last thread passing into the shadow of a stone. The gold silk bobbin has not been touched, and it waits in its tray with the patience of a small bright secret, its bone handle catching the late light. The weaver weaves the last few rows of the afternoon with the same measured pace as the first, refusing to hurry even as the day wanes. The fell of the cloth has advanced by a small but respectable amount, and the forest floor now holds 3 completed stones beside the suggestion of a stream bank that will be developed in the days to come. The hound's paw is still a little distance away, hidden in the unwoven warp, but the weaver knows exactly how many rows of green and brown must be laid down before its first outline appears. When the light has faded enough that the charcoal lines of the cartoon become difficult to read through the warp, the weaver ties off the working thread in a temporary knot around a warp end and sets the bobbin down. The comb is placed in its spot on the side beam, its teeth wiped clean of any stray fibers with a sweep of the thumb. The tray of bobbins is covered with a square of linen to keep the dust off overnight, and the weaver straightens the cushion on the bench before stepping back. The room is quiet now, quieter even than it was at dawn, because the town outside has begun to settle toward evening. The weaver looks at the loom one last time, letting the eyes travel from the cloth beam up to the warp beam, tracing the full length of the threads that have been worked and those that still wait. There is no sigh, no spoken word, no gesture that marks the end of the workday. The weaver simply turns toward the door, pauses to blow out the small oil lamp that was never lit, and steps into the narrow street. The loom remains behind, holding the new threads exactly where they were placed, and the cartoon waits in the darkness beneath the warp for the return of the morning. Days gather around the loom like leaves settling on still water, each one arriving with the same pale morning light and departing with the same warm fade toward dusk, and the lower border of the tapestry grows upward in a slow, steady accumulation that would be invisible to a visitor who stayed only an hour, but unmistakable to the weaver who sits with it every morning. The forest floor has become the quiet obsession of these weeks, a shaded ground that must hold the eye without calling attention to itself, a foundation that will support hounds, deer, hunter, and horse without ever demanding to be noticed in its own right. The weaver works this section with a particular kind of attention, the kind that knows how to make something rich and varied while keeping it subordinate to what will come later. The window above the work table now admits a slightly different quality of light than it did when the first green thread was laid. Spring has advanced into the longer days, and the sun climbs higher before it finds the narrow opening, which means the morning session begins in a cooler, grayer illumination, and the afternoon brings a golden wash that lasts well into what used to be early evening. The weaver notices this shift without remarking on it, moving the bench a hand's width closer to the window one morning, and then back again a few days later, when the angle changes once more. The rushes on the floor have been replaced with fresh ones, and the new green scent of them mingles with the wool in a way that makes the workshop smell like a meadow after rain, clean and alive. The basket of moss green wool has been refilled 3 times now, the weaver having worked through the original supply and sent word to the dyer across town for more. The new batch is slightly different from the old, its dye having been mixed in a fresh vat with weld picked later in the season, and the weaver has spent several careful sessions blending the 2 greens together so that no visible line divides the earlier work from the later. This blending is done by using a bobbin wound with 1 thread of the old green and 1 thread of the new. The 2 twisted loosely together and carried through the shed as if they were a single strand, and the resulting color shifts so gradually that only the weaver knows where the join lies. The forest floor, as the cartoonist drew it, is not a uniform carpet, but a varied terrain of small dips and rises, fallen leaves, flat stones, and the dark openings of imagined burrows beneath exposed roots. The weaver has been translating each of these features into wool, one tiny block at a time, working not in long horizontal rows from edge to edge, as might be done for a sky or a plane, but in short, shaped sections that correspond to individual leaves, individual stones, individual patches of moss. The technique is called hatching, and it involves building up a shape in small, irregular blocks of color that step across the warp in a way that softens the boundaries between one hue and the next. The weaver's hands have been practicing this hatching for so many years that the decisions about where to place the next block of lighter green or darker brown happen somewhere below the level of conscious thought, in the fingers and the wrists and the quiet, watchful part of the mind that never speaks. A single fallen leaf takes shape over the course of a morning. The weaver begins by consulting the cartoon through the warp, noting the leaf's pointed oval form and the charcoal line that runs down its center like a delicate vein, and then selects the wool with care, a medium green for the leaf's body, a darker green for the lower edge where shadow would gather, and a touch of yellowish green for the tip where the imaginary light hits. The shuttle does not travel the full width of the loom for this work. Instead, the weaver uses a set of small bobbins, each one dedicated to a single color area, and works them back and forth across only the width of the leaf, packing the threads together with the comb until the shape is dense and even. The leaf rises out of the mossy ground as a distinct form, its edges slightly jagged where the weaver has stepped the colors sideways, and yet from a distance, the distance at which a tapestry is meant to be seen, those jagged edges will soften into a natural, organic outline that looks as though it grew there rather than being placed. Beside the first leaf, a second one begins to form, angled differently, so that it appears to have fallen across the first. The weaver varies the green slightly, using a thread that leans more toward olive for this one, and adds a tiny highlight of the yellowish green along its central vein. The work is slow and repetitive, but the repetition is never exact, because each leaf has its own orientation, its own combination of shades, its own small contribution to the dappled texture of the forest floor. The weaver moves from leaf to stone to moss patch without any sense of hurry, building the ground as a painter might build a fresco, section by section, day by day. The flat stones of the stream bed have multiplied over the passing weeks. Where once there were 3, now there are 11. Each one defined by its dark brown outline and its lighter cross-hatched interior. The weaver has varied the stones deliberately, making some round and some angular, some large enough to hold a hound's paw, and some small enough to be mistaken for fallen acorns. The stream itself curves across the lower third of the tapestry in a gentle S that the cartoonist drew with a confident, flowing hand, and the weaver has been filling it with a blended blue-gray wool that shifts subtly as the stream moves from shade into imaginary light. The water is suggested rather than depicted literally, its surface indicated by the horizontal grain of the weft and the pale highlights that the weaver has worked into its upper edge where the stream passes beneath a gap in the overhanging branches. One of the most time-consuming features of the forest floor has been the area directly beneath the great oak trunk, where the cartoonist drew a tangle of exposed roots spreading outward like the fingers of a buried hand. The weaver has been working these roots in a dark brown that verges on black, each root a sinuous shape that crosses over and under its neighbors in a carefully planned sequence. Because the loom weaves from the bottom up, the roots that appear to go behind others must actually be woven first, and the weaver consulted the cartoon many times before beginning this section, tracing the lines with a fingertip held above the parchment to understand which root lay on top and which beneath. The work of the roots has taken 4 full days so far, and there are perhaps 2 more remaining before the last tendril disappears into the mossy ground. Throughout all these weeks, the weaver has maintained the same steady rhythm that marked the first morning. The hands have not quickened, the breathing has not shallowed, and the quiet expression on the face has not changed. The weaver arrives each day at the same hour, sits on the same bench, lifts the same heddle cords, and passes the same heddle cords and passes the same shuttles through the same warp. The only variation is in the colors chosen and the shapes built, and even these variations fall within such a narrow range that the overall impression of the work remains one of deep, continuous calm. The weaver has spoken to no one about the progress of the tapestry. The master of the workshop looks in occasionally, standing at the door for a few silent minutes before nodding and withdrawing, but no words are exchanged beyond a murmured greeting. The other weavers in the workshop work on their own looms at the other end of the building, separated by a plaster wall, and the sound of their combs tapping is so distant that it might be the echo of the weaver's own. The quiet year of 1430 continues to hold, the town remaining peaceful, the Duke's messengers absent, and the only interruptions to the work are the small, necessary ones of meals and sleep and the changing of the rushes. One afternoon, as the weaver works on a cluster of tiny mushrooms that the cartoonist drew at the base of the oak, a light rain begins to fall outside. The sound of it on the roof is a soft, diffuse patter that fills the workshop with a sense of shelter, and the weaver pauses the shuttle for a moment just to listen. The rain taps the high window, runs down the plaster wall in invisible streams, and fills the air with the clean smell of wet stone. The weaver breathes it in, looks at the half-finished mushroom cap glowing in pale tan wool against the dark root, and then resumes the work without having lost a single thread of focus. The rain continues through the afternoon, and the weaver weaves on, the rhythm of the comb blending with the rhythm of the drops until the two become indistinguishable. The lower border of the tapestry now stretches across the full width of the loom, a band of richly textured forest floor that rises to the height of a hand's breadth above the fell. It is complete enough that the weaver can lean back on the bench and see it as a whole, letting the eyes travel across the varied greens and browns and blue-grays without fixing on any single detail. The overall effect is exactly what it should be, a quiet shaded ground that invites the eye to rest before moving upward toward the figures that will eventually populate the scene. The weaver feels a small, wordless satisfaction at this, a feeling so mild it barely registers, like the warmth of the sun on the back of the neck when the window light shifts. But the forest floor is not finished yet. There is still the area on the far right, where the cartoon shows a fallen log covered in ivy, and the cluster of ferns near the stream's bend, and the scatter of acorns that the weaver has been putting off because they are so small they will require the finest wool and the steadiest hand. These details will fill the next several days, and the weaver looks forward to them with the same quiet patience that has accompanied every other stage of the work. The acorns will be satisfying to weave, each one a tiny oval of brown with a darker cap and a pale highlight, and the ferns will allow the use of a yellow-green that the weaver has been saving in a lidded pot since the start of the project. The light fades earlier now than it did a few weeks ago, the season having passed its peak and begun the slow turn toward autumn, and the weaver sets the bobbin aside while the window still holds a faint grey glow. The loom is covered with a length of undyed linen to keep the dust off overnight, and the bobbins are returned to their tray, and the comb is wiped, and the cushion is straightened. The weaver stands for a moment at the door, looking back at the shrouded shape of the loom, and then steps out into the street where the rain has stopped and the cobbles are dark and gleaming. The quiet year continues, and the forest floor will be waiting in the morning, ready to receive the last of its acorns. The first hint of the hound arrives not as a whole animal, but as a single paw, a pale shape that the weaver begins to discern in the unwoven warp long before any thread is laid down for it. The cartoon beneath shows the paw lifted from the ground in mid-stride, the toes slightly splayed, the curve of the knuckles drawn with the same careful charcoal line that the journeyman from Bruges once sharpened his stick to achieve. The weaver, having completed the scatter of acorns in the ivy-covered log on the forest floor, now sits with the eyes resting on this new section, while the morning light grows strong enough to read every detail through the cream-colored warp. The shift from landscape to animal is a quiet boundary, and the weaver crosses it with the same calm that has attended every other stage of the work, selecting the threads for the day with hands that know what is needed before the mind can name it. The wool for the hound will be a pale fawn color for the main body of the paw, a soft shade that the weaver mixed by blending white wool with a single strand of light brown, wound together onto a bobbin until the two threads twist around each other like the stems of a climbing plant. This fawn wool sits in one of the smaller baskets on the shelf, a batch dyed with young fustic and a careful measure of alum, and the weaver lifts the skein and holds it to the light, judging its warmth against the memory of a real hound's coat, seen once years ago in the Duke's own hunting party passing through the town. The fur of that remembered hound was pale but not white, with a faint golden undertone in the sunlight, and the weaver is satisfied that the fawn wool will capture this without needing to be re-dyed. For the shadows between the toes and the line of the knuckle, a walnut brown will serve, the same that built the oak roots, and for the tiny claw tips, a thread of undyed cream linen, harder and sharper than wool, will give the suggestion of hard keratin catching the light. The paw begins with its lowest edge, where the toes nearly touch the mossy ground. The weaver opens the shed and passes the fawn bobbin across a short span of warp, no wider than the paw itself, while the surrounding area waits in bare threads. The first row of fawn wool settles into the fell, and the comb taps it down, and then a second row follows, identical in width but stepped one thread to the right so the outline will slant at the proper angle. The cartoon shows the paw lifting upward and to the left, and the weaver follows that slant faithfully, adding one vertical row of fawn to the left edge while dropping one row from the right, so that the shape climbs diagonally across the warp like a slow, patient stair. Each row is packed against the previous one with the comb, and the fawn wool, being slightly finer than the moss green, requires more passes to cover the same height, which means the paw grows more slowly than the ground beneath it. The weaver works the paw through the whole of one morning and into the afternoon, the shape gradually resolving from a pale blur into a recognizable form. The foretoes become distinct as the weaver uses the walnut brown to draw thin vertical lines between them, each line a single pass of the darker bobbin that creates a separation without ever cutting the warp. The brown is also used to outline the gentle curve of the central knuckle, a rounded prominence that the cartoonist indicated with a soft loop of charcoal, and the weaver traces this loop in wool with a steady hand that never wavers. The claw tips are added last, tiny dots of cream linen that the weaver places with particular care, using the finest comb strokes to seat each dot snugly against its toe without pushing it out of alignment. As the paw rises from the ground, the weaver becomes aware that this small shape is the beginning of something larger. The hound's body will follow the paw upward and to the right, its chest and shoulders and long-running legs filling the space between the oak trunk and the stream. And then the second hound will appear behind the first, its body partially hidden by the ferns. The weaver does not hurry toward these larger forms. The paw must be finished first, and finished perfectly, because every subsequent part of the animal will depend on its placement. A mistake of a single thread's width at the paw would grow into a noticeable distortion by the time the body is complete, and so the weaver checks the cartoon frequently, leaning forward to peer through the warp and verify that the paw's position matches the charcoal lines exactly. The weaver takes the midday meal at the bench today, a piece of dark bread and a small wedge of cheese brought from the room at the back of the workshop, where a brazier keeps a pot of broth warm for anyone who needs it. Eating is done slowly, the bread chewed without hurry, the eyes resting on the loom the way a farmer's eyes might rest on a half-ploughed field. There is no sense of impatience to return to the work, only a quiet acknowledgement that the meal is a necessary pause and the work will resume when it is finished. A few crumbs fall onto the cushion and the weaver brushes them off with a sweep of the hand before picking up the fawn bobbin again. By the end of the second day on the paw, the shape is nearly complete up to the point where the ankle will join the lower leg. The weaver steps back from the loom and looks at the paw from a small distance, seeing it not as a weaver sees the individual threads, but as a viewer would see the tapestry from across a hall. The fawn wool glows softly against the dark greens and browns of the forest floor, and the walnut lines between the toes create a clear, readable separation. The cream claw tips catch the light and give the paw a slight sharpness, a visual hint of the animal's speed and purpose. The weaver nods once, a small motion that is more felt than seen, and then returns to the bench to begin the ankle. The ankle and lower leg require a subtle change in the wool. The fawn color continues as the main hue, but the weaver introduces a lighter thread for the front edge of the leg where the imaginary light would strike, and a slightly darker thread for the back edge where shadow would gather. These three tones are worked together in narrow vertical bands that run up the leg, the light and dark threads stepping sideways in small increments so that the transition is gradual rather than abrupt. The technique is the same hatching that built the forest floor, but applied to a living form, and the weaver takes a quiet satisfaction in the way the leg begins to take on a rounded, three-dimensional quality as the tones blend together. The second hound's paw appears a few days later, just to the right and slightly behind the first. its position indicating that this hound is on the near side of the stream, while the first hound has already crossed it. The weaver works this second paw in a slightly darker fawn, using a thread that carries more of the light brown in its twist, so that the two animals will be distinguishable from each other even though they share the same basic coloring. The second paw is angled more steeply than the first. Its toes spread wider, as if the hound has just pushed off from a stone, and the weaver follows the cartoon's lines with the same faithful care, building the shape row by row while the autumn light outside the window grows thinner and more golden with the advancing season. The beginning of the animals marks a shift in the weaver's rhythm that is too subtle for an observer to notice. The pace of the shuttle does not change and the comb still taps with the same measured regularity, but the weaver's attention has sharpened slightly, the eyes moving more frequently between the cartoon and the woven surface, checking and rechecking the placement of each new shape. The forest floor was a patient landscape that allowed small variations without harm. A leaf could be a little larger or smaller. A stone could shift a thread's width and the overall effect would remain. But an animal must be exact, its proportions true to life, its pose readable from a distance, and the weaver feels this responsibility as a quiet weight that is not unpleasant, like the pressure of a hand on the shoulder. The workshop continues to hold its peace. The other weavers in their part of the building are working on a different commission now, a large wall hanging for a merchant's house that features a garden scene with ladies and a unicorn, and sometimes the weaver hears the distant tap of their combs through the plaster wall, a sound so faint it might be the building settling. The master of the workshop looks in less often than he did in the spring, his attention taken by the negotiations for next year's commissions, and the weaver is left alone with the hounds and the deer and the patient, silent progress of the warp. One afternoon, when the lower legs of both hounds have risen to the point where their bodies must begin, the weaver pauses to wind a new set of bobbins. The swift creaks under the pale fawn skein, the bobbin fills, and the weaver's mind drifts to the next stage of the work. The broad chest of the first hound, the sweep of its belly, the long curve of its tail that will extend upward into the leaves. These shapes are larger than the paw and the leg, covering more warp threads in each row, and they will require more wool and more time per pass. The weaver wins 3 bobbins of fawn, 2 of the darker brown for the shadows, and a single small bobbin of a pale grey that will be used for the hound's muzzle and the inside of its ear. By the time the winding is done, the afternoon has faded, and the weaver covers the loom and steps out into the street, where the first fallen leaves of the season are skittering along the cobbles in a cool breeze. The next week sees the chest of the first hound grow across the warp in broad bands of fawn wool. The weaver works the chest from the bottom up, building the rounded mass of the animal's rib cage with rows that curve slightly upward at their ends to follow the cartoon's outline. The hound's body is stretched forward in the attitude of running, its front legs extended and its hind legs pushing off from the ground, and the weaver must shape the muscles of its shoulders and haunches with a few well-placed threads of darker brown that suggest the play of light and shadow over moving flesh. The cartoonist has drawn these muscles as a series of curved lines that flow along the hound's body, and the weaver translates each line into a single pass of dark brown that crosses the fawn at an angle, a tiny interruption that gives the animal its sense of contained power. The head of the first hound emerges from the warp on a morning when the light is thin and grey, a cool autumn day that makes the workshop feel especially sheltered. The head is long and narrow, the muzzle tapering to a black nose that the weaver will add later with a single thread of the darkest wool, and the ears are folded back against the neck in the flattening gesture of a running dog. The weaver works the head in the same pale fawn, but now introduces the grey wool for the muzzle and a touch of pinkish tan for the inside of the ear, a colour achieved by blending a strand of madder red with the fawn. The eye is a dark oval that the weaver places with particular care, building it up over 3 rows, so that it sits in a small hollow of slightly darker wool, and when it is finished, the weaver leans back and feels that the hound has begun to look back at the room with a quiet, woven life of its own. The second hound follows the same pattern, its body emerging a few inches behind the first, its legs stretched in a slightly different gait, its head turned a little more to the side so that its eye catches the imaginary light differently. The weaver works the 2 animals in parallel, switching back and forth between them as the rows advance, ensuring that their proportions remain consistent and their positions relative to each other stay true to the cartoon. The space between the two hounds is filled with a continuation of the ferns and the stream, which the weaver has not forgotten, but merely set aside while the animals took shape. The beginning of the animals has brought a new texture to the tapestry, a sense of movement that the forest floor alone did not possess. The hounds seem to pull the eye upward into the scene, their running bodies pointing toward the deer that will eventually turn its head above them, and the weaver feels this new direction without articulating it, sensing the tapestry's narrative rise through the fingers that guide the shuttle. The quiet year has not changed its pace. The town remains calm, the Duke's messengers remain absent, and the weaver remains seated on the same bench, doing the same work, thread by thread. Yet the tapestry has entered a new phase, and the weaver greets it with the same steady hands that built the forest floor, ready for the deer and the chase that will follow. The deer hangs in the unwoven warp above the hounds like a question, waiting to be answered in wool and silk. The cartoonist drew it with the greatest attention of the whole composition, the charcoal lines reworked and corrected, until the turning neck traced a curve so graceful that the weaver sometimes pauses simply to look at it through the cream-colored threads before the day's weaving begins. The deer is caught in the middle of the chase, its body angled sideways across the tapestry, its head turned back over its own shoulder to look toward the hunter who will eventually appear farther up and to the left. It is the central moment of the hunt, the instant of recognition between pursuer and pursued, and the weaver feels the weight of it without any anxiety, only a quiet commitment to getting every thread right. The weaver begins the deer with its hind quarters, which emerge from the ferns at the right side of the tapestry, just above the second hound's extended muzzle. The wool chosen for the deer's body is a silvery brown, a blend of light brown with a strand of grey that gives it a cool, shadowed quality, unlike the warm fawn of the hounds. The weaver spent a full morning testing different mixtures, holding small twists of blended wool against the woven hounds to see how the colours spoke to each other, and finally settled on a combination that makes the deer distinct from the dogs while still belonging to the same woodland palette. The silvery brown has a slight sheen in direct light, a quality that comes from the long staple fleece of a breed raised in the hills south of the town, and the weaver handles it with particular care because its smoothness makes it more likely to slip in the shed if the tension is not exactly maintained. The hind leg of the deer rises from the ferns in a long angled line, the hock joint drawn by the cartoonist as a sharp outward point that the weaver follows with a single pass of dark brown wool. The muscle above the hock is built in broader blocks of the silvery brown, the weft packed tightly in some areas and left a fraction looser in others to create the subtle swell of flesh over bone. The deer's body will be the largest single shape in the tapestry so far, larger than either hound, larger than the oak trunk, and the weaver works it with the same patient hatching that built the forest floor, building up the flank in small irregular sections that step the color from light to dark and back again. As the flank grows upward, the weaver introduces a cream-colored wool for the deer's belly, a pale underside that catches the imaginary light and marks the transition from the body's upper color to its lower. The cream is worked in short horizontal rows that curve along the cartoon's outline, and where it meets the silvery brown, the two colors are stepped together, so that the boundary is soft and gradual. The weaver checks the cartoon many times during this phase, leaning close to read the charcoal line that divides belly from flank, and adjust the position of the cream rows by single thread when necessary, a small correction that is made without frustration and without any sound beyond the tap of the comb. The deer's turned neck is the most demanding passage of the whole figure, and the weaver approaches it on a morning when the sky outside the window is white with high cloud, and the light in the workshop has a flat, even quality that makes it easier to judge subtle differences in wool tone. The neck must twist in a way that reads clearly from a distance, its muscles showing beneath the skin as the deer looks backward. The cartoonist indicated this twist with a series of overlapping charcoal curves, and the weaver translates each curve into a line of slightly darker brown that crosses the silvery wool at a shallow angle. These lines are built one at a time, each one taking no more than a few passes of a thin bobbin, and when they are all in place, the neck seems to rotate smoothly on the warp, the deer's head turning as naturally as if it had been caught by some sound in the forest. The head of the deer is smaller than the hound's head, more delicate, with a narrow muzzle and a large eye that the cartoonist drew as a perfect oval, surrounded by a ring of tiny lashes. The weaver builds the head over 3 days, working the silvery brown for the main shape, the cream for the throat and the inside of the ear, and a dark thread nearly black for the nose and the outline of the eye. The eye itself is a small miracle of patient weaving, a dark oval that the weaver places exactly where the cartoon indicates, surrounded by a thin ring of the lightest fawn and then a dot of black at its center, so small that the weaver must split a single thread of wool to achieve it. When the eye is finished, the weaver leans back on the bench and looks at it for a long moment, and the deer looks back from the warp with a calm, gentle gaze that contains no fear of the approaching hounds, only a quiet awareness. The antlers spread upward from the deer's head into the leaves of the oak canopy, and here the weaver faces a particular challenge. The antlers must be woven in a pale bone color, a mix of cream and the faintest touch of gray, and they must be visible against the green leaves that will surround them. The cartoonist drew the antlers as a branching pattern of fine lines that weave through the foliage like bare winter branches against a summer sky, and the weaver will need to work the antlers and the leaves at the same time, alternating the bone bobbin with the various greens so that the antlers always stay in front of the leaves. This is slow work, the bobbin changing with every few passes, the comb tapping each new thread into place before the next begins, and the weaver settles into it without any sign of impatience. Above the deer and the hounds, the landscape continues to rise toward the top of the tapestry. The weaver has been working on a low stone wall that runs diagonally across the middle ground, a boundary marker between one part of the forest and another, drawn by the cartoonist as a row of irregular blocks with moss growing in their crevices. The stones are built in shades of grey and tan, each one slightly different from its neighbours, and the moss is the same green used for the forest floor, now reappearing in small patches that tie the lower tapestry to the upper. The wall is not a dramatic feature, but it serves to anchor the scene and give a sense of depth, and the weaver completes it over the course of a week, fitting the stones together like a mason working in wool instead of rock. Beyond the wall, a cluster of oaks rises toward the canopy, their trunks broader than the single oak in the foreground, and their leaves spreading outward in layers of dark green and yellow-green. The weaver works these trees from the bottom up, building the trunks in the same walnut brown as the foreground oak, and then branching outward in a spreading pattern that follows the cartoon's charcoal lines. The leaves are built in small blocks of varied green, each block a cluster of a dozen weft threads that the weaver packs tightly to create a dense, opaque surface. Between the leaves, small diamonds of a lighter green suggest the sky shining through, and the weaver uses a pale blue-grey thread for these tiny gaps, a color that reads as distant atmosphere rather than solid sky. The stream that began in the lower border continues upward through the middle ground, passing behind the stone wall and winding toward the left edge of the tapestry. The weaver has carried the blue-grey thread of the water up through the weeks, maintaining its subtle shifts of tone, and now works it around the base of the oaks, where the stream narrows and quickens over a small fall of flat stones. The water is suggested by the horizontal grain of the weft, a contrast with the vertical emphasis of the tree trunks, and the weaver spends several afternoons on this section alone, making sure the stream reads as a continuous path through the landscape. Far in the distance, above the oaks and the wall and the turning deer, a castle tower rises on a hill so small in the cartoon that it occupies a space no larger than the weaver's thumb. The tower is the very castle where this tapestry will hang, and the Duke asked for it to be included, a small signature of ownership that the cartoonist placed with a neat, precise hand. The weaver works the tower in grey and blue-grey silk, the same precious thread that will later be used for the Duke's coat of arms, and the tiny crenellations at its top are built with single passes of darker grey that create a sawtooth edge against the pale sky. The hill beneath the tower is a soft green that fades to blue in the distance, and the weaver blends the two colours carefully so that the tower seems to emerge from the landscape rather than sit on top of it. The hunter appears last of all in this middle section, a distant figure on horseback who sits above and behind the deer, still far enough away that his features are not yet visible. The weaver has not yet woven the hunter's body, but the space for him is marked by the ever-advancing fell, and the weaver looks at that space sometimes in the late afternoon when the light catches the unwoven warp and makes it shimmer. The hunter will come in his own time. his howpland, falcon and horse all waiting in the cartoon. But for now the weaver is content to work the deer and the oaks and the distant tower, building the middle of the tapestry as slowly and as carefully as the foundation beneath it. The autumn has grown cooler, and the weaver now wears a wool over-tunic in the mornings until the warmth of the day settles into the workshop. A small brazier has been brought in and placed near the door, its coals glowing a dull red beneath a grating, and the smell of charcoal mingles with the wool and the rushes. The weaver pauses sometimes to warm the hands over the brazier, flexing the fingers in the rising heat, and then returns to the bench without any sense that the pause was an interruption. The quiet here holds. The town remains peaceful, and the tapestry grows upward into the oaks and the stone wall, and the turning deer that looks back with its calm, woven eye at the hunter who is still to come. The weaver has now reached the point in the composition where the millefleur's border will soon begin to climb the sides of the tapestry, a field of tiny flowers that will frame the hunt scene and carry the Duke's coat of arms in each corner. The border has been waiting in the lower edge all this time, a narrow band of dark green with the first hints of small red and yellow flowers, and now it will rise alongside the deer and the oaks, repeating its pattern with the same steady regularity that governs everything else on the loom. The weaver winds a new set of bobbins for the border, choosing a bright madder red for the small roses, a weld yellow for the tiny daisies, and the same gold silk for the centers of the flowers and the details of the shields that will eventually appear. These bobbins join the others in the tray on the side beam, a growing company of colors that the weaver will call upon as the tapestry rises toward its upper edge. The afternoon light through the window is thinner now than it was in summer, more golden and more slanted, and it paints the warp with a warm glow that makes the cream threads look almost like spun honey. The weaver works the antlers of the deer in this light, the bone-colored wool catching the glow and holding it, and the leaves surrounding the antlers absorb the warm tone and deepen into a richer green. The whole tapestry at this hour seems to breathe a quiet warmth, and the weaver sits at the center of it, the shuttle moving back and forth with the same rhythm that began in the spring and will continue until the last thread is laid down. The deer watches, the hounds run, the hunter waits, and the weaver weaves on. The millefleur's border has been waiting at the edges of the tapestry since the very first days of the forest floor, a narrow band of dark ground that the weaver laid down as a quiet promise of what would eventually frame the hunt. Now, as the deer and the hounds and the turning oaks rise through the middle of the warp, the time has come to fill that dark band with the 1,000 tiny flowers that give the pattern its name. The weaver opens the lidded pot of madder red and the small basket of weld yellow and the precious sealed box of gold silk, and the border work begins on a morning when the first real chill of late autumn breathes against the window, and the brazier glows a little brighter near the door. The millefleur's pattern is a repeating field of small blooms, each one no larger than a thumbnail when woven, arranged in staggered rows that climb the sides and top of the tapestry like a garden seen from above. The cartoonist drew this border with the aid of a parchment stencil, pricking the outline of a daisy, a viola, and a small 5-petaled rose through the paper with a needle, and then pouncing powdered charcoal into the holes, leaving a dotted ghost on the cartoon that the weaver could follow without ever consulting a measuring stick. The stencil marks are still visible through the warp, faint grey dots that cluster into the shapes of petals and centers, and the weaver studies them for a long moment before lifting the first bobbin of madder red. The daisy is the simplest of the 3 flowers, a round center surrounded by a ring of small oval petals, and the weaver begins with these, working upward along the left edge of the tapestry where the border meets the forest floor. The center of each daisy is a single small circle of gold silk, no more than 6 passes of the finest bobbin, and the petals are built in madder red with a touch of white wool blended in to give them a soft pinkish tone. The weaver works each flower as a small isolated shape, completing it before moving on to the next, so that the border grows upward in a steady accumulation of finished blooms. The combination of gold and red against the dark green ground is rich and calm, a quiet celebration of color that catches the eye without demanding it. After the daisies have risen in a row along a hand's breadth of the left border, the weaver switches to the violas, which the cartoonist drew as tiny purple blooms with delicate veining on their lower petals. The purple wool comes from a small skein dyed with a mix of woad and madder, a color that leans toward the cool side, and provides a contrast with the warm red of the daisies. The violas are slightly smaller than the daisies, and the weaver must work them with an even finer touch, using the smallest bobbin in the collection and making only 2 or 3 passes for each petal. The veining is suggested by a single thread of darker purple that crosses the lower petal at an angle, a detail so small that it will be nearly invisible from the floor of the Great Hall, but which the weaver adds anyway, because the cartoon asked for it, and because the quiet year allows for such care. The rose is the largest and most complex of the border flowers, a 5-petaled bloom that the cartoon is placed at regular intervals to anchor the pattern. The weaver works each rose in a deeper red than the daisies, a madder that was left in the dye bath longer and took on a richer, almost crimson tone. The petals are built in 3 shades of red, the darkest at the base where they meet the gold center, a medium red for the main body, and a lighter red for the outer edges where the imaginary light would strike. This shading gives each rose a slight roundness, as though the petals were curving outward from the woven surface, and the gold silk at the center glows against the deep red like a small ember. The weaver places these roses at the intervals marked by the cartoon, checking the distance between them with a careful eye to ensure the repeat stays even. The border work is a different kind of weaving from the forest floor, or the animals, where the hunt scene required constant reference to the cartoon and frequent changes of color and direction. The mille-fleurs border is more regular, more rhythmic, and the weaver's mind settles into it as into a familiar melody. The pattern repeats in a cycle of daisy, viola, rose, daisy, viola, rose, with small green leaves filling the spaces between them, and the weaver can work this cycle for long stretches without needing to pause and consult the cartoon, the fingers knowing when to change the bobbin and when to shift the position of the blooms. The comb taps steadily, the bobbins are lifted and set down in their turn, and the border grows upward along both sides of the tapestry in a slow, silent march. At the 4 corners of the border, the cartoonist drew the Duke's coat of arms, a shield with a lion rampant and a small crown above it, repeated so that no matter how the tapestry is hung, the Duke's identity will be present. The weaver approaches the first corner with particular attention, because heraldic work must be exact. The shield is drawn in charcoal as an inverted triangle with a flat top and slightly curved sides, and the weaver outlines it in dark brown wool before filling the interior with a rich blue that comes from a special skein of silk dyed with the most expensive woad, a color that reads as deep azure against the dark border ground. The blue silk has a subtle sheen that separates it from the surrounding wool, and the weaver works it with the same bone-handled bobbin that carries the gold. The lion rampant is a small masterpiece of weaving, its body no larger than a thumb from nose to tail, and yet requiring 5 different colors to be read correctly. The weaver builds the lion in gold silk for the main body, with a red tongue and red claws added in single threads of madder and a small blue shield upon its chest that repeats the azure of the background. The lion's tail curves upward in an S shape, and the weaver follows this curve with 2 parallel threads of gold, packing them tightly so that the tail stands out clearly against the blue field. The tiny crown above the shield is worked in plain gold, with 3 small points, each point created by a single pass of the bobbin, stepped outward by 1 thread, and the weaver adds a dot of red silk to the tip of each point as a final, barely visible flourish. The second corner at the top left of the tapestry is completed a few days after the first, and the weaver then works the right side corners in the same manner, so that all 4 coats of arms are in place before the border has climbed fully to meet them. The symmetry of the 4 shields appeals to the weaver's sense of order, and the quiet satisfaction at seeing them all in their proper places is a small warmth in the chest, something felt rather than thought. As the autumn days shorten and the light through the window fades earlier each afternoon, the weaver begins to work on the upper horizontal band of the border, which will close the composition across the top of the tapestry. This band is wider than the side borders, and the cartoonist filled it with a richer profusion of flowers and leaves, including small bunches of grapes and the occasional tiny bird perched among the vines. The grapes are built in a soft purple-grey, each one a round shape of 3 or 4 passes, and the birds are worked in the same pale blue-grey silk that colored the distant sky gaps between the oak leaves. The weaver weaves these upper details with the same steady rhythm, while outside the first frost of the season whitens the rooftops and the weaver's breath shows faintly in the air until the brazier warms the room. The millefleur's border has now been under the weaver's hands for several weeks, and it has transformed the edges of the tapestry into a flowering frame that holds the hunt scene in a gentle, colorful embrace. The dark green ground of the border recedes behind the brighter flowers, and the whole composition has begun to feel complete at its boundaries, even as the center still waits for the hunter and his horse. The weaver runs a hand lightly over the woven border, feeling the dense, even texture of the packed weft, and the hand finds no loose threads and no uneven patches. The brazier crackles once, a small sound that briefly interrupts the tap of the comb, and the weaver glances toward it before returning to the work. The bobbin with the gold silk is nearly empty now, and the weaver will need to wind more before tackling the hunter's hauptlandy and the falcon's jesses that wait higher up on the warp. But that is a task for another morning, and the afternoon has already begun to dim toward evening. The weaver sets the gold bobbin in the tray, covers the loom with the length of undyed linen, and straightens the cushion on the bench. The border flowers seem to glow in the last light that falls across the workshop, their reds and golds and purples, a quiet record of the steady hours spent. The loom waits, the millefleurs hold their bloom, and the weaver steps out into the cold street, leaving the tapestry to its silent night. The final weft thread of the tapestry is tucked on an afternoon in late autumn, when the light through the high window has thinned to a pale silver grey, and the brazier by the door breathes a steady warmth into the workshop. The weaver has been working the topmost section of the border for the past several days, filling the last span of the millefleurs with daisies and violas, and then building the hunter's falcon in pearl grey silk, with its tiny jesses hanging in two curved lines no thicker than a single thread, and then adding the final highlight to the hunter's gloved hand, where it holds the jesses, a dot of cream wool that catches the light and completes the figure. Now the last bobbin is empty, the last shed is closed, and the comb taps one final time against the fell of the cloth, a soft wooden click that sounds no different from any of the thousands that came before it, but which the weaver feels as a small, quiet punctuation at the end of a long and patient sentence. The weaver leans back on the bench and lets the hands rest on the knees, the fingers loose and still after so many months of motion. The body does not feel tired in any sharp or complaining way. The tiredness is more like the gentle settling of a stone into soft earth, a slow acknowledgement that the work has been long and full and is now complete. The cushion on the bench has grown thin from all the hours it has been sat upon, and the weaver makes a mental note to refill it with fresh straw before the next warp is begun. But that note is filed away in the same patient part of the mind that holds the measurements for the hound's paw and the antler's curve. From the bench, the weaver looks at the whole length of the tapestry, letting the eyes travel from the lower border where the mossy forest floor still holds its scatter of leaves and stones, up through the running hounds with their outstretched paws, past the turning deer with its calm dark eye, across the stone wall and the cluster of oaks, to the hunter on his grey horse with the falcon on his wrist, and finally to the top border where the millefleurs frame the scene in a quiet celebration of reds and bolds. The tapestry is complete, every thread in its place, every shape built as the cartoon asked, and the weaver feels a mild, wordless satisfaction that is too deep for smiling, but too warm for indifference, a feeling that fills the chest like the heat from the brazier fills the room. The weaver stands, moving a little more slowly than usual, because the body has learned the shape of the bench and must now unlearn it, and walks around to the far end of the loom where the warp threads stretch from the warp beam to the fell. Somewhere in the middle of this stretch lies the point where the woven cloth ends and the bare warp still waits, a span of cream-colored threads that has been diminishing for months as the fell advanced toward the warp beam. Now only a short length of bare warp remains, no more than the distance from the weaver's elbow to the fingertips, and the threads are clean and tight and have been waiting for this moment since the day they were wound onto the beam. The cutting of the warp is a small ceremony that the weaver performs without any audience. The iron scissors, the same small pair that have trimmed the ends of bobbins and snipped the occasional slub, are lifted from their place on the side beam, and the weaver tests their edge with a thumb, finding it still sharp. Starting at the left edge of the loom, the weaver takes the first warp thread between two fingers, draws it slightly away from its neighbor so the scissors can find it cleanly, and snips it through with a single small motion. The thread parts with a tiny sound, a soft tick that is absorbed by the wool in the room, and the cut end springs back very slightly toward the warp beam. The weaver moves to the next thread and cuts it in the same way, and then the next, and the next, working across the width of the loom in a slow, steady progression that has the same rhythm as the weaving itself. A rhythm now applied to the act of release. The cutting of the full warp takes the better part of an hour, because there are hundreds of threads, and each one must be cut individually so that nothing tangles and nothing is pulled out of the woven cloth. The weaver's hands work steadily, the scissors opening and closing in a quiet silver pulse, and as each thread parts, the tapestry grows incrementally freer from the loom that held it for so long. By the time the last thread at the right edge is cut, the weaver's fingers are slightly stiff from the repeated motion, and the tapestry lies loose on the loom surface, no longer anchored to the warp beam, but still supported by the framework of the side beams and the cloth beam to which its lower edge remains attached. The weaver sets the scissors aside and goes to the far end of the loom, where the cloth beam holds the finished lower portion of the tapestry in a tight roll. This beam has been turned very slightly over the months, drawing the woven cloth forward and away from the weaver as the work progressed, and now it holds the entire lower half of the tapestry wrapped around its thick oak cylinder, like a scroll of wool and silk. The weaver places both hands on the beam's turning handle, a wooden peg that fits into a hole at one end, and begins to wind it slowly, drawing more of the tapestry forward. The cloth rolls onto the beam in a smooth, even layer, and as it does, the upper portion of the tapestry comes into view, the part that was until moments ago stretched across the working area of the loom. The deer slides into view, and the hunter and the falcon, all of them passing gently over the breastbeam as the weaver turns the handle with a slow, careful motion. When the tapestry has been wound forward far enough that its upper edge is free of the working area and lies draped over the breastbeam, the weaver stops turning and examines the back of the cloth, the side that has been facing downward all these months. The back of a low-warp tapestry is always slightly different from the front, the colours less distinct where the weft has been packed against the warp from the underside, and the weaver runs a hand over the surface to check for any loose threads or uneven patches. The hand travels across the millefleur's border, over the coat of arms with its gold lion, down through the oak leaves and across the deer's flank, and everywhere the texture is even and firm, the threads locked together by the tight packing of the comb. The weaver finds no faults, and the hand withdraws, satisfied. The next step is to detach the tapestry from the cloth beam, which requires the weaver to loosen the cord that has held the leading edge of the cloth in place since the very first day of weaving. The cord is made of stout hemp, and it has been wound around the cloth beam in a tight spiral, pinning the warp ends against the wood. The weaver unties the knot at one end, a knot that was tied so many months ago it has grown stiff with time, and then unwinds the cord loop by loop, each loop releasing another section of the tapestry's lower edge. The warp ends at this edge are short and even, trimmed to the same length months ago, and they form a neat fringe that the weaver gently combs out with the fingers so that the threads lie straight and parallel. This fringe will be sewn into a hem later, or perhaps left as a decorative edge depending on the duke's preference, but for now it is simply straightened and left to hang. The tapestry, now completely free of both beams, lies in a long, heavy fold across the loom, its full length visible for the first time since the weaving began. The weaver steps back and looks at it, and the tapestry looks back with its woven eyes, the deer's calm gaze and the hunter's distant profile, and the hound's bright alert expression, all fixed in wool and silk, as they will remain for decades beyond this quiet afternoon. The colours in the late autumn light are muted and rich, the greens deepened by shadow, the reds warmed by the brazier's glow, the gold silk catching the faintest glimmer from the high window. The weaver does not think in words about the beauty of the cloth. The weaver thinks only that the cartoon has been followed and the threads have been true. Now the tapestry must be rolled for transport. The weaver fetches a length of undyed linen from the shelf, a clean cloth that has been waiting for this purpose, and spreads it on the swept floor in the open space between the loom and the door. The tapestry is lifted from the loom with care, the weaver taking its upper edge while the master of the workshop, who has appeared at the door as if summoned by the silence of a stopped loom, takes the lower edge. Together they carry the heavy length of cloth across the room and lay it face down on the linen, the back of the weaving facing upward so that the front will be protected when it is rolled. The weaver smooths the tapestry flat with both hands, working from the center outward to press out any folds or wrinkles, and then folds the edges of the linen over the tapestry's sides to create a complete wrapping. The rolling is done slowly from the lower edge upward, the weaver and the master turning the cloth together in a tight, even cylinder, pausing every few turns to adjust the linen and make sure no creases are forming. The weight of the tapestry resists slightly as the roll grows thicker, the wool and silk dense from months of packing, and the weaver feels the solid heft of it in the arms and the shoulders, a physical reminder of the sheer amount of material that has passed through the hands in the form of small bobbins and individual threads. By the time the roll is complete, it is as thick as a man's thigh and nearly as long, bound with 3 hemp ties that the master secures with the same kind of knot that once held the warp to the beam. The rolled tapestry is lifted upright and leaned in a corner of the workshop, wrapped in its linen and tied with its cords, ready for the wagon that will come to carry it to the Duke's castle. The weaver stands beside it for a moment, one hand resting on the wrapped cloth as if saying a silent farewell, and then turns back to the loom where the task of cleaning and preparing for the next warp must begin. The loom is now empty, its side beams and breast beam bare, its heddle cords dangling loosely above the place where the warp once stretched. The weaver collects the small scraps of wool and silk that have gathered in the tray over the months, dropping them into a basket that holds the usable remnants. Threads that are too short for bobbins but which can be carded into new wool or used for stuffing cushions. The comb is white with a bit of oiled cloth to keep its teeth smooth, and the scissors are placed in their leather sheath, and the bobbins are returned to their tray after the last threads are unwound from their cores. The room is tidied slowly, without hurry, each tool put back in its proper place so that the next warp can begin without confusion. The cartoon, which has lain beneath the warp all these months, is now fully visible on its shelf, its charcoal line smudged in a few places from the gentle pressure of the warp above, but still legible in every detail. The weaver slides the shelf out and looks at the drawing one last time, tracing a finger above the vine that curls around the oak, the hound's paw, the deer's antlers, all the shapes that have been translated from charcoal into wool. The cartoon has served its purpose, and the weaver slides it back into its place with the same gentle care it received on the first day, a document that will now be stored or reused or perhaps given to another weaver who can learn from its composition. The empty loom waits clean and still in the center of the room, its wooden frame dark with age and beeswax, its heddles hanging in their patient rows, its cloth beam and warp beam standing ready for the next design. The weaver stands at the window for a long moment, looking out at the autumn street where the last leaves are falling from the single tree that grows beside the well. The quiet year of 1430 is drawing toward its close, and the tapestry that filled its days has moved from the loom to the corner, from possibility to completion, from thread to cloth. Tomorrow or the next day, the weaver will begin to wind a new warp, perhaps for the merchant's garden scene that the other weavers have been discussing, or perhaps for a new commission that has not yet arrived. But that is tomorrow or the next day, and for now the weaver is content to stand at the window and feel the cool air on the face and listen to the distant sound of the town settling into evening. The brazier burns low, the room holds its peace, and the loom waits, empty and ready, and full of quiet promise. The weaver turns from the window, banks the coals for the night, and steps out into the street where the first stars are beginning to appear above the rooftops, leaving the tapestry rolled in its corner and the workshop silent behind the closed door. The wagon that carries the rolled tapestry arrives in the narrow street outside the workshop on a morning when the sky is the color of unwashed fleece and the air holds the crisp, dry smell of fallen leaves. It is a simple cart with 2 high wheels and a bed of planed oak, drawn by a single bay horse whose breath steams in the cold as it stands waiting. The driver, a man from the Duke's own stable who has made this journey many times before, climbs down and exchanges a few quiet words with the master of the workshop, while the weaver watches from the doorway, hands tucked into the sleeves of a wool-over tunic. The rolled tapestry, still wrapped in its undyed linen and bound with 3 hemp ties, is lifted by the driver and the master and laid gently onto the cart bed, where it rests on a cushion of straw that has been spread to absorb the jolts of the road. The weaver helps to secure the roll with leather straps that pass over it and buckle to iron rings on the cart's sides, pulling each strap snug but not tight enough to crease the cloth inside. A length of oiled canvas is drawn over the whole load and tied down at the corners, a protection against any rain that might sweep across the open country. The driver checks the harness of the bay horse, adjusts the bridle, and then climbs back onto the narrow seat at the front of the cart, taking up the reins with the same unhurried ease that the weaver brings to the shuttle. The master nods, the driver clicks his tongue, and the cart begins to move, its wheels rumbling over the cobbles with a low wooden sound that fades gradually as it turns the corner and disappears toward the town gate. The weaver stands in the street for a little while after the cart has gone, watching the empty space where it was, and then returns inside to the workshop where the loom sits clean and bare. The journey to the Duke's castle will take the better part of 2 days along roads that wind through the autumn countryside, past harvested fields and small villages and stretches of woodland where the oaks still hold a few brown leaves. The driver will stop at an inn the first night, stabling the horse and keeping the cart in the yard under a lean-to, and the tapestry will travel with him as a silent passenger, wrapped in its linen, unaware of the miles passing beneath its wheels. On the second afternoon, the cart approaches the castle from the south, climbing a long slope of open grassland that rises toward a ridge. The castle sits atop this ridge, its grey stone walls catching the low autumn sun, so that they glow a pale, warm gold. It is not a fortress of high towers and battlements, but a comfortable seat of administration and residence, with a great hall whose tall windows face the valley, and a gatehouse that opens onto a courtyard where servants and stewards go about their daily tasks. The driver guides the cart through the gate, nodding to the guard who recognizes the stable livery, and draws up before the entrance to the great hall, where a set of wide stone steps leads to a pair of iron-studded doors. Word that the tapestry has arrived passes quietly through the lower offices of the castle. A steward in a dark tunic comes out to inspect the roll, checking the seals on the linen wrapping against a note in his ledger, and then summons 2 servants to carry it inside. The tapestry is lifted from the cart with the same care it received in the workshop, the servants supporting it at both ends and walking slowly up the steps, through the doors and into the great hall where the air is cool and still and smells of aged stone, wood smoke, and the faint beeswax of polished furniture. The great hall is a long room with a high timbered ceiling and a row of tall windows along one wall, their panes of greenish glass letting in a watery light that falls across the flagstone floor. At the far end of the hall, a wide hearth holds a fire that has been burning since morning, its flames reduced now to a steady bed of red coals that crackle softly and send a thin ribbon of smoke up the chimney. The walls are hung with other tapestries, older ones whose colors have softened with decades of candle smoke and daylight. And the new spot where the hunt scene will hang is a large empty space directly opposite the windows, its dimensions marked by iron hooks already fixed into the stone. The servants set the rolled tapestry down on a long trestle table that has been cleared for the purpose, and the steward cuts through the hemp ties with a small knife, then unwraps the linen covering in slow, deliberate folds. The tapestry emerges from its wrapping like a butterfly from a cocoon, its colors bright and fresh in the dim hall, the greens and reds and golds so vivid against the soft gray of the stone that even the steward pauses for a moment, his hand resting on the edge of the linen, to look at what the weaver has made. The deer turns its calm eye toward him, the hounds run frozen in their chase, and the millefleur's border blooms along every edge with its cycle of daisies, violas, and roses. Hanging the tapestry requires the steward and both servants to climb onto a wooden scaffold that has been wheeled into position, and the weaver, who is not present to see it, might have felt a small flutter of concern had he known how heavy the cloth feels when lifted high. But the servants are practiced at this task, and they work together without speaking much, rolling the top edge around a wooden batten that will distribute its weight evenly, then lifting the batten onto the iron hooks while the steward guides it from below. The tapestry unfurls slowly against the wall, its lower edge falling straight and true, its weight pulling the weave taut so that the scene flattens into a smooth, even plane. A few adjustments are made, a slight shift to the left to center it perfectly between two wall sconces, and then the batten is secured and the scaffold is wheeled away. The steward stands in the middle of the hall with his ledger still in hand and looks at the tapestry from the distance at which it was designed to be seen, a distance of perhaps 20 feet. From here, the tiny details that the weaver labored over for so many days disappear into the larger sweep of the composition. The hatching on the deer's flank becomes a smooth gradient of light and shadow. The individual flowers of the millefleurs merge into a continuous band of color, and the distant castle tower recedes into its proper place as a small pale shape on the horizon. The hunt scene reads as a unified whole, the eye drawn upward from the forest floor along the line of the running hounds, pausing at the deer's turned head and then continuing to the hunter on his grey horse with the falcon on his wrist. The steward closes his ledger, tucks it under his arm, and walks away to attend to other duties, leaving the tapestry to settle into its new home. As the afternoon fades into evening, the great hall fills with the ordinary life of the castle. Servants come to lay the long tables for supper, setting out wooden platters and cups and loaves of dark bread wrapped in linen cloths. The fire in the hearth is built up with fresh logs, and the flames leap and dance, their light casting moving shadows across the walls and bringing the tapestry to a different kind of life. The gold silk in the lion rampant catches the firelight and glows, and the blue of the coat of arms deepens into a rich midnight shade. The hunter's face, so carefully woven in pale wool, seems to shift its expression as the light moves, now serene, now slightly stern, now simply distant. The deer's eye, that tiny oval of dark brown with its dot of black, flickers with a borrowed life whenever a flame leaps particularly high. Those who pass through the hall during the evening glance at the new tapestry as they go about their tasks. A kitchen boy carrying a platter of roast fowl pauses for a moment and looks at the hounds, their stretched bodies reminding him perhaps of the dogs that sleep by the kitchen fire. A waiting woman with a jug of ale notices the flowers along the border and comments to her companion that they look almost real enough to pick. The Duke himself is not in residence that evening, having travelled to a neighbouring estate to discuss matters of land and sheep, but his absence does not diminish the quiet presence of the tapestry. It hangs in the hall as a statement of identity and permanence, a woven signature that says, "This is a house of order and beauty, a house that can wait a year or more for a cloth to be made, a house that values the patient hand." The fire burns lower as the evening wears on toward night, and the servants clear the tables and bank the coals and draw the heavy curtains across the tall windows. The great hall settles into darkness and silence, the only light coming from the red glow of the embers and the faint glimmer of starlight that finds the edges of the curtains. The tapestry hangs unseen through the night, the hunt frozen in mid-stride, the deer forever turning, the falcon forever perched, the millefleurs forever blooming in their dark woolen field. The castle sleeps, and the tapestry sleeps with it. Back in the town, the weaver has not been idle. The morning after the tapestry departed, the workshop felt different, emptier not just of the rolled cloth, but of the particular purpose that had filled it for so many months. The weaver spent that first day tidying the room even more thoroughly than before, sweeping the packed earth floor with a broom of bound twigs, wiping down the side beams of the loom with a cloth dipped in linseed oil, and sorting through the baskets of leftover wool to see which colors could be used again and which should be sent back to the dyer for re-dyeing. The cartoon was carefully lifted from its shelf, rolled loosely around a wooden dowel, and stored in a tall wicker basket where the workshop kept its archive of used designs. It would serve perhaps as a reference for a future commission, or perhaps simply remain as a record of the year's work. On the second day after the tapestry's departure, the master of the workshop came to the weaver with news of the next commission. A merchant from Dijon, a man who dealt in wine and cloth and had grown wealthy from the trade routes that passed through Burgundy, wished to have a wall hanging made for his private chapel, a scene of a walled garden with a fountain and a lady reading beneath a rose arbor. The commission was smaller than the Duke's hunt, perhaps 10 feet by 8, and the weaver listened to the description with the same calm that had greeted the Duke's instructions 2 winters ago. The master produced a small roll of parchment with the merchant's specifications, and the weaver unrolled it on the work table, reading the neat clerk's script that described the colors and the dimensions and the hoped-for completion date. The quiet year was ending, but the quiet work continued. Preparing a new warp is a task that the weaver has performed so many times, it feels less like labor and more like a ritual of return. The warp beam of the low warp loom is unbolted from its brackets and carried to the long gallery at the back of the workshop where the warping frame stands against the wall. The frame is a tall rectangle of wooden pegs set into a board, and the weaver begins to wind the new warp around it, walking back and forth with a cone of cream-colored linen thread, counting the ends in a soft murmur while the pegs guide the thread into a long, even coil. The motion is steady and repetitive. Walk, wrap, count, walk again, the thread passing through the weaver's fingers with a slight warmth from the friction. Outside the gallery, the first breath of winter stirs the bare branches of the tree by the well, and the weaver works on, unconcerned with the cold. The warping takes the better part of 2 days, and when it is done, the warp is transferred to the loom in a careful process that requires the help of the other weavers from the far end of the building. They come without being asked, 4 of them, and together they lift the coiled warp from the frame and carry it to the loom, where it is fed through the heddles and the reed, thread by thread, in a steady communal rhythm. The weaver sits on the bench while the others hand the threads through the gaps, and the room fills with the soft sounds of linen passing through wood, the quiet murmur of instructions, and the occasional small joke that passes between the weavers like a shuttle crossing a shed. By the end of the second day, the new warp is stretched taut from cloth beam to warp beam, its cream-colored threads gleaming in the light of the oil lamp that has been lit against the early winter dark. The cartoon for the merchant's garden scene has not yet arrived, so the weaver will spend the next few days weaving a plain header band of dark wool that will stabilize the warp and provide a starting edge for the tapestry. This header is woven in a simple plain weave, the shuttle passing from edge to edge without any shaping, and the weaver settles into it with a sense of quiet homecoming. The bench cushion has been refilled with fresh straw, and it no longer sags in the middle. The bobbins, newly cleaned and oiled, gleam in their tray. The comb taps with its old familiar rhythm, and the weaver's hands move with the same slow certainty that carried the hunt scene from forest floor to Millfleur's border. The days shorten toward the winter solstice, and the light through the high window grows more precious with each passing week. The weaver works the header band in the grey mid-morning light, and then in the brief golden hour of early afternoon, and then by the glow of the oil lamp as the evening closes in early. The brazier by the door is kept well fed with charcoal, and the workshop is warm enough that the weaver can work without the wool over tunic, the sleeves of the linen under tunic pushed back as they were in the spring. The quiet year of 1430 has not quite ended, but its character has shifted from the long, unhurried days of summer to the more enclosed, more intimate stillness of winter, and the weaver feels this shift as a comfortable change, a variation in the same peaceful theme. One evening, after the header band has grown to the width of a hand and the new warp has settled into its proper tension, the weaver puts away the tools and covers the loom with its linen cloth and stands for a moment looking at the wrapped shape of it in the dimness. The tapestry that travelled to the castle is hanging now in its great hall, the firelight moving over its surface while the castle sleeps, and the new warp waits in the same workshop where the old one once waited. And the weaver feels a sense of continuity that requires no words and no celebration. The hands, which have woven a forest floor and a deer's turned neck and 1,000 tiny flowers, will now weave a walled garden with a fountain and a lady reading under roses, and the shuttle will pass, and the comb will tap, and the quiet will remain. The weaver banks the coals in the brazier, blows out the oil lamp, and steps into the street where a light snow is beginning to fall, the first of the season. The flakes drift down slowly through the still air, catching the glow from a nearby window, and settle on the cobbles without sound. The weaver pulls the hood of the overtunic over the head and walks toward the narrow house by the river, where a bowl of broth and a warm hearth wait. Behind, the workshop stands dark and silent, the loom holding its new warp in patient stillness, ready for the morning when the weaver will return and the shuttle will begin again, and the quiet year will continue into the next, thread by thread, as it has always done.